On June 19, 1876, Sir Nigel Gresley was born in Edinburgh, Scotland. Much later in life, after attending school in Sussex and Marlborough College, he served an apprenticeship at Crewe Works for the London and North Western Railway. He later became a pupil under John Aspinall at Horwich Works for the London and Yorkshire Railway, and after serving many minor appointments with the railway, he became outdoor assistant in the carriage and wagon department in 1901, then appointed assistant works manager at Newton Heath Depot in 1902, and then works manager in 1903. In 1904, he then became assistant superintendent of the carriage and wagon department, and then moved to the Great Northern Railway as carriage and wagon superintendent in 1905. In October 1911, he became chief mechanical engineer for the GNR, succeeding Henry A. Ivett. Then he became CME for the London and North Eastern Railway, one of the Big Four railway companies that was established in 1923. During that same year, his most famous locomotive had entered service, which was number 1472, later to be named Flying Scotsman. And ever since the engine had come out of Doncaster Works, it was given an illustrious life. But while Flying Scotsman was enjoying its success as the L&R's PR engine, Sir Nigel had gone forth with a brand new design for a locomotive that was built for speed. This was the birth of the A4 class locomotives. The A4's streamlined casing traces back to the Bugatti rail car, designed for French railways by Italian racing car driver and manufacturer Ettore Bugatti. A prototype was built in spring 1933 and was a success after mainline trials. A production batch followed, and several had entered service running from Paris to Deauville, reaching its speeds during test at 113 miles per hour. Gresley had taken a trip on the railcar during the same year, along with his assistant Oliver V. Bullied, but he was less than impressed with it and complained about the bumpiness of the ride when travelling at 80 miles per hour, and often complained to the railcars. However, after testing Bugatti's designs at the National Railway Physical Laboratory at Teddington and at the City and Guilds Engineering College in London, he had found them to be superior. But for the Bugatti railcar, the safety restrictions from France had limited more of the railcar's testing, which allowed another rival to surpass its speed record. The locomotive was called Fliegender Hamburger, in English, the Flying Hamburger. In wake of Hitler's rise to power, great emphasis was made to modernize the German National Railway, such as reducing unemployment, boosting Germany's industry, and creating projects that would admire the world. The Flying Hamburger was delivered in 1932, and entered service in 1933, running trips from Berlin to Hamburg, covering 178 miles in 138 minutes at speeds of 77.4 miles per hour. This wouldn't be surpassed until 1997, when Germany began using intercity express trains between the two cities. Gresley was watching this from afar, and discussed the events with his friend Winston Churchill, who would later become Prime Minister. In May 1933, the L&R approved Gresley and Bullied's visit to Germany to see the Flying Hamburger locomotive themselves. In June 1933, officials from the L&R and Bullied, once again, visited Berlin to take a trip on the engine. While the German officials were welcoming of their visit, they refused the L&R and Bullied to see the maintenance operations as well as the technical details. However, Bullied had managed to see the problems himself while a set was being tested in the Netherlands. A year after his visit to Germany, Gresley went to the country again to see if the Flying Hamburger might be suitable for the East Coast Mainline. But the one big drawback was the cramped passenger compartment, and Gresley knew that passengers would not like to be cooped up for a long journey from London to Edinburgh, and remained convinced that his Pacific locomotives can do the job better. Back in England, 4 A4 locomotives were ordered to be built at Doncaster. But when the new Silver Jubilee service was introduced, the first and only A4 delivered at the time, Silver Link, had entered service on September 7, 1935. The service was made to commemorate the 25th anniversary of King George V's reign on the throne. On September 27th that same year, Silver Link pulled a demonstration train from London and achieved the speed record of 112.5 miles per hour, that is 181 kilometers an hour, beating all previous speed records. The 3 other A4 locomotives, Quicksilver, Silver Link and Silver Fox, were delayed due to issues with the streamlined casing. The A4s that came after them were all named after birds due to Sir Nigel's fondness of wild birds. However, back in Germany they believed the steam's finest hour has yet to come. The Borsig Locomotive Works had applied experimental streamlining on the DRG's 03 class locomotive and carried out test runs. Using the data from these tests, they had built three 464s 86 feet 2-inch long 05 class locomotives. The first two, 05001 and 05002, were similar in design, while 05003 was cab forward and were used on test runs between Hamburg and Berlin between 1935 to 36. On June 7, 1935, number 05002 had reached a top speed of 119.1 miles per hour near Berlin. It made 6 more runs reaching 110 miles per hour with trains weighing up 250 tons. However, the crowning achievement came on May 11, 1936, when it hauled a 194-ton train from Berlin to Hamburg, reaching 124 miles per hour. But it was made with no intention in mind of a test run, nor as an intentional speed run. The German railway officials were worried about Hitler's support for road transport when the Nazi Party came into effect in 1933, with an announcement of a major Autobahn construction days after Hitler became Chancellor. This was seen as a major threat to the railways, and they wanted to show the Nazi Party that their system has much more to offer. On the day of the record run, 05002 was taking a train from Berlin to Hamburg with their VIP guests, including 2 who would later go down in history for their genocidal crimes towards Jewish people, Heinrich Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich. The train ran smoothly until a series of red signals had made it slow down on its journey, which had irritated the VIPs. Railway officials were worried that the irritation might lead to anger and contempt, and told the footplate crew to throw caution to the wind and let fly, which ended up giving them the speed record. A year later in Nazi Germany, the Flying Hamburger had surpassed Bugatti's railcar's 113 miles per hour record when the German railcar reached 122 miles per hour in 1937. During the same year, the London, Midland and Scottish Railway, one of the LNER's biggest rivals, had made their own record when 6220 Coronation, part of the LMS's Coronation class, had attained a speed record of 114 miles per hour on the West Coast Mainline. A year later, Mallard entered service on March 3, 1938. 4 months later, it would achieve a record run, one that not only surpasses Coronation Scots, but Flying Hamburgers and 05002s as well. And it's a record that it still holds to this day that would lead to an event that 10 years ago this year, 2023, where all 6 surviving A4s were together for a once-in-a-lifetime event in 2013. Chapter 1, July 3rd, 1938. The problem with running faster is that braking distance becomes longer, and to solve that, braking has to be improved, and furthermore signalling systems needed to be improved as well. Gresley looked at the Westinghouse system that the LMS had used, and had arranged a series of trials which involves rapid acceleration, followed by brake test. The engine chosen for this test was 4468 Mallard. The driver Joe Dunnington was chosen by Gresley for the test run, as well as fireman Thomas Bray. This test run was so top secret that even Mallard's crew weren't told about it, despite several weeks of rumours amongst everyone in the LNER. 2 carriages from the Coronation set, along with 1906 Northeastern Railway built dynamometer car number 902502, were arranged ready for the special run on Sunday, July 3rd, 1938. The Westinghouse airbrake team arrived at Wood Green Waterworks siding in North London to find Mallard looking pristine, with the dynamometer car couple behind. Gresley hadn't attended the run due to an illness, and standing in his place was his deputy Douglas Edge. Also on board was Bernard Atkinson from the locomotive running department, and Eric Bannister, who had helped find the solution to the chimney problem on Mallard at the testing laboratory in Teddington. The solution was simple, that was done by chance. A minor dip at the rear of the chimney on a 1x12 model of Mallard sent the smoke clear of the engine, which had delighted Gresley. The reason for this special run still hadn't been revealed to the footplate crew nor Inspector Sam Jenkins or the Westinghouse team until Mallard departed the yards at 11:46 a.m. A series of ordinary brake testing was done between 90 to 100 miles per hour until they came to their intended stop at Barkston, a few miles north of Grantham in Lincolnshire. On the return journey, Mallard had a good run south of Barkston to climb Stoke Bank at speed, with the record being attempted on the downward grade. The train arrived at Barkston at 2:49 p.m, before those on board had lunch in the restaurant car. Douglas Edge later summoned the Westonhouse team and told them the true purpose of the run, and that was to reclaim the record that the LMS had beaten. They were offered a taxi to Peterborough if they did not want to partake on this historical-making trip, but the offer was refused, and who could blame them? The train departed Barkston South at 4:15 p.m, but were restricted at 80 miles per hour due to track maintenance at Grantham instead of the usual 60 to 70 miles per hour for express trains, much to the dismay of the footplate crew. However, Fireman Bray made use of the time to build a big fire. Despite running at 25 miles per hour at the beginning of the climb at Stoke Bank, Dunnington soon got Mallard up to 65 miles per hour with a full-pressured boiler. It then climbed Stoke Summit and then passed the signal box at 85 miles per hour. It then entered Stoke Tunnel, with red-hot cinders passing the windows, with the passengers being delighted at the sight before the lights were turned on by the guard. Meanwhile, the record keepers in the dynamometer car saw that Mallard passed Stoke Summit at 6 miles per hour faster than Silver Fox when it set its record run on that spot. Mallard then accelerated down Stoke Bank faster than Silver Fox had done. Within minutes, the speedometer reached 120 miles per hour, beating the LMS's record. For a quarter of a mile, the needle recorded 126 miles per hour at milepost 90 1/4 between Little Bytham and Essendine, beating the German record, and Mallard had made its rightful entry in the history books forever as the fastest steam locomotive in the world. Edge was asked if the crew should try go one better and reach at 130 miles per hour. But with Essendine Tunnel approaching, it was decided not to risk it. Later on the run there was a distinct smell, and that was Mallard's middle big end running hot while developing 3,000 cylinder horsepower and had to slow down as much as possible to Peterborough. At the station they were greeted with the national press waiting on the platform after being tipped off by the achievement, and soon Mallard's name became recognisable as Flying Scotsman's, with its name plastered around all the newspapers not just in Great Britain, but the world as well, and Mallard had rightfully earned its nickname that was dubbed by the press as the Blue Streak. Chapter 2. Mallard's Aftermath. With the record run now in the history books, Mallard continued running passenger trains around the East Coast Mainline. When outshopped in 1938, it, like many of its siblings, was fitted with valances. These were removed in spring 1942 for ease of maintenance during World War II, and was repainted in wartime black in June. The distinctive A4 chime whistle were removed and destroyed from the class that same year under government order, because they believed people would confuse them for air raid sirens. In the post-war and the nationalisation period, it was painted in different liveries. It was painted in British Railway Garter Blue livery until mid-1952, where it was painted in Brunswick BR Green livery, derivative of the Great Western. In 1949, Mallard was chosen to be compared by other locomotives from the old Big Four companies by the new nationalised railway company to find the best attributes of speed, power, coal and water efficiency. This was done in order to draw up new designs for the standard locomotive. Mallard hauled the last non-stop the Elizabethan run from King's Cross to Edinburgh Waverley on September 8, 1961. 11 days later, September 19, 1961, it achieved another triumph with running from King's Cross to Newcastle with 11 coaches in tow from Torlington to Essendine. On Stoke Bank it reached 78 miles per hour, at 82 miles per hour up the 1 in 440 gradient as the slopes eased beyond to Corby Glen. Mallard then retired after 25 years of service on April 25, 1963. However, it was destined for preservation when the British Transport Commission drew up a list on what to preserve. However, a rule was made that if a particular locomotive type was identified, it would usually be the first one built in the class. Silverlink was the first, but Mallard was a record holder and was therefore chosen over Silverlink, who was sadly scrapped. Mallard was restored with its valances back in place and was repainted in its LNER Garter Blue livery at Doncaster Works, ready to be on display at the Museum of British Transport that was to be opened at Clapham in 1964. By 1969, the museum was losing £30,000 a year and was threatened with closure. It then moved to Syon Park in 1973, but 2 years later, 1975, Mallard was then allocated to the National Railway Museum in York. It ran on the main line, but was towed by another locomotive. It was placed on display at York's railway station in 1977 to celebrate the station's centenary along with other items from the National Railway Museum. It then visited Doncaster Works for an open day commemorating the 125th anniversary of the plant in 1978. But Mallard's long-awaited return to steam had finally come when it was restored in time for the 50th anniversary celebration of its 126 mph record run in 1988. Mallard's first movement under steam was in 1985 during the National Railway Museum's 10th anniversary celebrations, despite no boiler cladding. The restoration was backed from the Scarborough Borough Council, which had also backed the Scarborough Spire Express in the year 1981. The resort contributed £35,000 towards the cost of the restoration of the locomotive. Mallard returned to the main line and steam in 1986, and its first mainline passenger run happened on July 9th that year, when it hauled British Rail's Scarborough Spire Express from York to Scarborough. More trips were made during 1986, as well as 1987. When 1988 arrived, Mallard did a series of special runs for its 50th anniversary. In May 1988, it hauled a post office special from Melbourne to Banbury. The run was made to celebrate the launch of 4 stamps featuring transport in the 1930s, one of them being Mallard, and also it was made to celebrate the 150th anniversary of sorting mail on the move. On the day of the anniversary, Mallard took a special train from Doncaster to Scarborough with several members of the crew from 1938 on board as guests of honour. Mallard steamed for the last time on August 27, 1988, and had returned to the museum as a static exhibit. It was considered for the engine to partake in the 150th anniversary of Dutch Railways in the Netherlands in 1989, but it had failed its boiler test and instead it was replaced by City of Truro. However, it had gone outside the walls of the museum post-1988. In 2003, it returned to the plant at Doncaster amongst other engines, including other A4s and Flying Scotsmen to mark the plant's 150th anniversary. Then in 2008 it was placed outside of the museum along with some of its siblings to mark Mallard's record's 70th anniversary. From June 2010 until July 2011, it was placed on display at the NRM's sister museum Locomotion at Schilden. Plans were made to display the engine at the BD Museum in Nuremberg, Germany, to place alongside the surviving member of the German Class 05 locomotive fleet 05001, but it failed to materialize. 0502, the record holder that we mentioned earlier in this video, as well as 05003, was scrapped in 1960. Chapter 3: Union of South Africa. Number 4488 Union of South Africa entered service on June 29, 1937. Originally it was to be called Osprey, in tradition with the class being named after a breed of bird, but was renamed to Union of South Africa once outshopped to honour the British Empire and the coronation of King George VI, along with 5 others, one of which had been preserved alongside Union of South Africa. However, it would carry its intended name much later in its running life. Prior to that, the name was carried by classmate number 4494. The locomotive was painted in garter blue livery, but was later applied with LNER wartime black on March 21, 1942, and then altered on August 14, 1943, when the tender letters became NE. It was once again painted in garter blue on February 21, 1947. In 1946, it was renumbered as 60009 and was affectionately nicknamed Number 9. During its latter years, Union of South Africa hauled the last booked steam haul train from King's Cross on October 24, 1964. It was 20 minutes late through Grantham due to a broken rail at High Dyke. It was also the last locomotive to be overhauled at Doncaster while in service. It then retired from service on June 1, 1966. The next month it was sold to John Cameron, a Scottish farmer who had owned his line to run the locomotive in Fife. The railway was called the Lochte Private Railway and was later converted to a steam museum during the early 1970s and was soon closed in 1992. On the private line, Union of South Africa provided cab rides until it was allowed on the main line when the ban was lifted by British Railways in 1973, and had been one of the most consistent mainline registered steam engines still in the ownership of John Cameron. During the 1980s and early 1990s, the A4 had carried its intended name Osprey instead of Union of South Africa due to international public disgust at the continuation of apartheid in South Africa. In 1994, it hauled the first steam train into King's Cross in 30 years on a rail tour from Peterborough under the banner of the Elizabethan. It carried on pulling more tour trains well into the 21st century. Chapter 4: Dominion of Canada. Originally going to be named Buzzard but later called Woodcock, Dominion of Canada entered traffic on May 4, 1937. It was later named Dominion of Canada by Canada's High Commissioner H. Vincent Massey on June 15, 1937. It was called that because the A4 was chosen to pull the coronation service. The Canadian coat of arms were placed on the side of the cab, and a Canadian Pacific Railroad type bell was mounted ahead of the single chimney. The bell was operated by steam and was used in service. It was also given a Canadian Pacific Railway whistle as well. During the same year, the engine was trying to reclaim the record that was taken by the LMS, but it only reached 109.5 miles per hour when travelling down Stoke Bank. It was then caught in a collision at Hatfield and was repaired at Doncaster Works between January 31st to March 18, 1939. Like the other A4s, it was repainted into wartime black with valance removed for ease of maintenance during World War II, and was modified in November 1943 when the tender carried the letters NE. It was reapplied in Garter blue in November 1947. The Canadian coat of arms were removed in April 1949. The whistle was replaced with a standard chime whistle, and the bell was removed when it received a double blast pipe car-chapped chimney the same year as well, and then was painted in BR dark blue with black and white lining in September 1950. 2 years later, it was repainted in Brunswick green. Dominion of Canada was one of the A4s allocated to Scotland when the Deltics displaced them on services on the East Coast Mainline, and was withdrawn from service in 1965 at Darlington. It was later placed at the back of the power motor depot in a weed-choked siding, all forgotten. It was then later taken to Darlington Works to be refurbished after an agreement was made between British Railways and the Canadian Railroad Historical Association to donate it to the association with its bell that was in storage. It later moved to Crewe after the closure of Darlington Motor Power Depot in 1966 to carry on the cosmetic restoration. It was presented to Geoffrey Murray, who was acting High Commissioner of Canada at the Royal Victoria Dock in London in April 1967, and was shipped to Canada's Expo Rail at Delson St. Constant, Quebec, near Montreal. Attempts were made to purchase the locomotive so it could be brought back to the United Kingdom, but the offers were refused by the museum. Chapter 5. Dwight D. Eisenhower. When the locomotive entered service on September 4, 1937, it was originally given the name Golden Shuttle. It was going to be called Sparrow Hawk, but that was later given to number 4463. It was also painted in wartime black in January 1942, and was later modified in March 1943. After the Second World War, it was later renamed Dwight D. Eisenhower, in honor of the Supreme Commander of Allied Forces during the latter of World War II, and who would later become the 34th President of the United States from 1953 to 1961. Eisenhower had a strong connection with the railways of Britain, as there had been 2 military command trains in Britain during the run-up to D-Day, which were used for the future president's exclusive use. These were mainly stock from the Great Western Railway and codenamed Alive, which included 2 Gresley coaches which were a favourite to the general. It was intended to invite Eisenhower to the unveiling, but it couldn't be arranged. However, he had attended the formal declaration of the locomotive at the National Railroad Museum in America in 1964. Meanwhile, over in the United States, steam was replaced with diesel locomotives much earlier than the UK. At Green Bay, Wisconsin, a railroad museum was established called the National Railroad Museum by the Great Lakes west of Chicago. A Yorkshire woman going by the name of Miss Kovacek was on holiday and visited the museum, and was talking to a man who she thought was a gardener. She told him about an engine named after the 34th president. The gardener turned out to be the chairman of the museum's board, Harold E. Fuller. When he found out the locomotive's name, he was determined to have it as part of the museum's collection. However, British Railways would not sell it to him. Dwight D. Eisenhower would carry on pulling passengers with many livery changes and shed allocations along the way, like its many siblings, until it was withdrawn from service on June 20th, 1963. This time, BR were happy to donate the locomotive and the 2 LNER coaches to the museum in Green Bay, and the locomotive was later cosmetically restored, still in its BR green livery at Doncaster, and was later shipped to New York Harbor in May 1964, and was later transferred by rail later that month. It was later reunited with fellow Gresley-built engine Flying Scotsman when the locomotive was on tour in the United States between 1969 to 1972. In celebration of what was to be Eisenhower's 100th birthday in 1990, it was moved to Abilene, Kansas for celebration. The move was carried out slowly both on the forward and the return, since the coaches that BR had donated from the command train used British vacuum braking, which is incompatible with the American air brake train. In 2000, a new building was established at the museum, and the A4 stands pride of place with the Gresley coaches attached next to one of the surviving big boy locomotives, which was number 4017. However, research from both the United Kingdom and the United States had led to the engine's custodian to realise that the engine would almost certainly never have hauled either of its namesake's military trains during World War II. Chapter 6. Sir Nigel Gresley. The co-author of the locomotives of the LNER 1923-37, K. Ritz and Prentice, came up with the idea of naming the 100th Gresley Pacific after the designer of it all. The engine entered service on October 30th, 1937. A year later, to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Race to the North, Sir Nigel Gresley was chosen to pull the new set of coaches for the Flying Scotsman service. Passengers who were travelling on the Great Northern Railway Stirling Single No. 1 were transferred to the new carriages from the vintage six-wheel carriages of the East Coast joint stock that had come with the Stirling Single at King's Cross at Stevenage. Sir Nigel Gresley took the passengers that had boarded the new set around the East Coast before returning to London. Like many of its siblings, it had its valances removed due to wartime, was repainted into different liveries, and had many shed allocations. However, it had one claim to fame during the post-war era. In 1959, it was claimed that Sir Nigel had reached 100 miles per hour at Stevenage on the outward journey to Doncaster, and ascending Stoke Bank had hit 83 miles per hour between Essendon and Little Bytham. On the return, Stoke Summit was passed at 75 miles per hour, with the speedometer rising to 99 miles per hour before Corby Glen, reaching 109 miles per hour by Little Bytham. It soon reached 112 miles per hour, and it's a post-war steam record that Sir Nigel still holds to this day. After many years of service, the locomotive was withdrawn on February 1st, 1966. But thankfully it was saved by an organisation called the A4 Preservation Society and transferred to Crewe Works for overhaul and returned to service in 1967 hauling rail tours under the Society's new name, the A4 Locomotive Society Limited. During the post-steam era, Sir Nigel Gresley took part of the Rail 150 cavalcade in 1975 to celebrate the 150th anniversary of the first railway in Britain, with other locomotives that took part on the day. It even took part of another cavalcade in 1980 to celebrate the 150th anniversary of Rocket's Rainhill trials. It was depicted on a postage stamp from Royal Mail under their famous trains line, and not only that, but it was chosen to run special trains between Melbourne and Stratford-upon-Avon in 1985. In 1994, it was based at the Great Central Railway, and then it was based at the East Lancashire Railway until it was then stationed at the North Yorkshire Moors Railway in 1996, and has been settled there ever since. In 1999, the organisation that owns Sir Nigel had become a registered charity and was called the Sir Nigel Gresley Locomotive Preservation Trust Limited, and is operated by the A4 Locomotive Society on behalf of the Trust. When London was hosting the Olympic Games in 2012, Sir Nigel was chosen to take the torch with PE teacher Kelly Williams on board when the torch was coming through North Yorkshire. An honour for the locomotive whose speed record hadn't been beaten yet. Chapter 7. Bittern. We now come to the last A4 locomotive, called Bittern. It was outshopped at Doncaster Works on December 18, 1937. Like many of its siblings, it was fitted with side valances and were then removed as a wartime measure. It was repainted, renumbered, and was allocated to different sheds many times during its service life until it was withdrawn in September 1966. It was later sold into the private hands of Jeff Durry and was used on rail tours, but it was found that Bittern had mechanical problems and was withdrawn from service in the early 1970s. In 1988, Bittern was repainted into its sibling Silver Link and was placed on display alongside Mallard and Sir Nigel Gresley in celebration of Mallard's speed record's 50th anniversary. Bittern was transferred to the Great Central Railway in Loughborough to be restored in 1995, but it had only reached a partial stage of dismantling. Eventually it was bought as a kit of spare parts to the late Dr. Tony Marchington, the third and final private owner of Flying Scotsman from 1996 to 2003. But due to Flying Scotsman's expensive overhaul, Marchington sold Bittern to Jeremy Hoskin in 2001. Under Hoskin, Bittern was moved to the Midlands Railway and was restored into steam in 2007. 2 years later, a second tender was added to Bittern, allowing it to run all 188 miles from London to York non-stop. In 2011, while hauling the Great Britain 6 rail tour, Bittern was disguised as another member of its class, which was number 4492 Dominion of New Zealand. The real one was built in 1937 to honour the coronation of King George V, as well as the British Empire, and was commissioned by the High Commissioner of New Zealand for the UK, Bill Jordan, but was sadly scrapped in 1963. The original engine was fitted with a New Zealand Government Railway 5-chime whistle, which was fitted shortly after it was commissioned, so a suitable whistle was borrowed from the Glenbrook Vintage Railway. In 2012 it was reverted back to Bittern, but with the Garter Blue livery still intact. Usually the speed restriction for mainline steam tours in the UK is at 75 miles per hour, but in 2013, in honour of Mallard's record's 75th anniversary, and with special permission granted by Network Rail, Bittern was to pull 3 trains at the speed of 90 miles per hour. Its first run of these special trains was on June 29, 2013, from London's King's Cross to York, where it clocked 92.8 miles per hour. When it arrived in York, it was moved to the NRM's South Yard, ready to be displayed amongst its other siblings, ready for the Great Gathering. But before we see the event, let's see how the 2A4s from North America have been moved from their respective museums to their country of origin. Chapter 8. The Big Move. News of the idea of having 6 A4 locomotives together for the 75th anniversary celebrations was first revealed in 2011, when Heritage Railway magazine's website reported that talks were made for 6 months between the NRM and the 2 North American museums to bring the 2 A4s over there back to the UK. As mentioned earlier, there were offers made in the past to have the 2 A4s returned to the United Kingdom, but both museums refused. However, the National Railway Museum's director at the time, Steve Davies, had made a new offer. The museum would borrow the 2 locomotives for 2 years in order to have them lined up with their siblings at York, and would return them to their respective countries once the festivities were over. A win-win for both sides. Along with that deal, the 2 engines were also to be cosmetically restored for display, with Dominion of Canada to be repainted in LNER Garter Blue, along with its Canadian bell, and Dwight D. Eisenhower was to be repainted into its BR Brunswick Green livery. After Steve Davis made a series of visits between both museums had surprised everyone that they agreed to the deal. The story was reported as an exclusive in issue 154 of Heritage Railway magazine. Heritage Railway and its sister, the Railway magazine, were later invited by Steve Davis as the event's media partners. The last time the 2 locomotives were transferred to their custodians was back in the 1960s. It was a fairly simple task, with just taking them by rail to the nearest port and be loaded onto a ship that was bound for their destination back then. But getting them back was no easy task in itself. The move was tasked by MoveRight International, who have a long good history moving locomotives from overseas and back to the UK. They even moved Flying Scotsman back in the UK after its tour of Australia. One of their jobs from the NRM was transferring the Shinkansen 0 Series locomotive from Southampton Docks to the museum after West Japan Railway had donated it to the museum in 2001. For Dwight D. Eisenhower, it was on a piece of isolated track inside the museum building and stood alongside other pieces from the Green Bay Museum's collection. First, the tender had to be uncoupled and had to be pushed across the museum floor with hydraulic jacks. It was hard work, but they managed. But the Dwight D. Eisenhower was an even bigger task. In order to get it past the museum's Big Boy and GG1 electric locomotive, it had to be lifted by the hydraulic jacks, and then as it neared the Big Boy and the building pillar, it has to be shifted into a zigzag position to get it through. When the maneuvering was done, Dwight D. Eisenhower was moved out of the building for the first time in years under the scorching summer sun, with temperatures of 100 degrees Fahrenheit, around 37 degrees Celsius. It was later moved onto some rail cars bound for Nova Scotia and Canada. However, problems were made along the way. Firstly, Canadian National, who were taking the locomotive, could not find a route from Chicago to move the engine and its tender, which eventually disappeared into Illinois. The crew from MoveRight had spent 5 days looking for it, until luckily one of them was sent an email with a photograph attached of the pair in Kirk Yard. Then US Customs managed to lose the document authorizing the use of MoveRight's lifting gear, but it eventually reached Canada on August 12, 2012. Meanwhile, Dominion of Canada was moved out of its shed at Expo Rail in Canada by the museum's John Molson replica, and then would have to place onto the flat car that had taken Dwight D. Eisenhower, and would turn it round onto the museum's turntable so the points can be changed to get it out of the correct route of the museum. However, the flat car was longer than the turntable, and it blocked the path they need to get it out. So temporary rails had to be made to give the flat car more room to be placed on the turntable so the points can be changed. It arrived at Nova Scotia, and it and Dwight D. Eisenhower were on board a cargo ship on September 25, 2012 for a week's sea voyage bound for Liverpool. The A4 locomotives arrived in Liverpool on October 3rd, with a select group of media witnessing the event. After being unloaded and with customs paperwork being completed to allow them to be released from Liverpool Freeport, the two A4s made their way by road to the NRM's Shildon-based museum locomotion. However, only one low loader was available and had to make 2 journeys for the locomotives. Dwight the Eisenhower was taken to Shildon first on a Thursday afternoon, and Dominion of Canada was to be taken early Saturday morning. The 2 engines reached Shildon without any fault and had touched British rails for the first time since leaving for their respective countries since the 1960s. The 2 locomotives were placed on public display at the museum free of charge. In October 2012, Union of South Africa had even joined the repatriated pair as well, and given the public a glimpse of what was to come on July 3, 2013. Later, the 2 A4s were repainted by Heritage Painting. Mallard was repainted as well by the same company in August 2012. The movement of the 2 locomotives from North America to the United Kingdom was later shown on the British television show Monster Moves on August 29, 2013. Many people say that this dream would never come true, but those detractors were proven wrong. Chapter 9. The Great Gathering. With all 6 A4s together, the Great Gathering was about to begin. To hype up the event on July 2nd, mega rock star and railway enthusiast Rod Stewart was on BBC's One Show, and was given the honour to pull the lever to allow Bittern to be shunted into the museum ready for the big day on Wednesday, July 3rd, 2013. We were lucky enough to witness this event ourselves, as shown in our Rail Around Great Britain special uploaded on our original YouTube channel, RANSW. To start off the day, we see 60163 Tornado pulling into York Station, painted in British Railways Express blue livery with passengers from London's King's Cross. Tornado is the 50th member of the Peppercorn Fleet and was built by the A1 Steam Locomotive Trust. Construction of the locomotive began in 1994 and was completed in 2008. The name Tornado was chosen to honour the Royal Air Force Panavia Tornado air crews who had served the Gulf War between 1990 to 1991. Like the Great Gathering, Tornado too had its detractors when being constructed, but they were proven wrong in 2008. After dropping off its passengers, Tornado now heads to the National Railway Museum's yard, ready to be serviced for its return journey to London's King's Cross. While that was happening, we moved to the museum to see the 6 surviving A4s, sponsored by model railway company Hornby, who had produced limited edition models of the A4 locomotives that were on display in the museum. The event took place between July 3rd to the 17th, 2013. Let us take a look at the 6 surviving A4s during this once-in-a-lifetime event that have brought rail fans from not just the United Kingdom, but from the world over. After the event, we see DB Shankar's 67 class diesel locomotive departing York with a Pullman train, as we wait to see 60163 Tornado getting ready to head back to London with its passengers. Our day concludes with Tornado now ready to head for London, and what a day it had been. More events were held to honour the 75th anniversary. One of these events was on July 22, 2013, when King Charles III, who was Prince back in 2013, was invited to the event as he was the patron of Mallard 75. However, his visit took place 5 days after the first Great Gathering event, and the operational A4s had gone back to resume their duties. Bittern carried His Royal Highness to the event, and also on the same day he had become a grandfather for the first time, as his grandson Prince George of Wales was born on the same day. Between September 7th to the 8th, 2013, Mallard was taken out of the museum to be taken to Grantham Station, which stands just north of the stretch of Stoke Bank, where its 126 miles per hour record was made. Later that month, Mallard returned to its home at Doncaster to be placed on display at the same time of Doncaster St Leger Festival Week. Then it went to Chesterfield for the Barrow Hill Live 2013 event, which was held at the former Staveley Midland Roundhouse. It was placed on display alongside 60163 Tornado. After the event, Mallard went back to the museum in time for the autumn event of the Great Gathering from October 26, 2013. During the latter part of 2013, Bittern was doing more of its 90 miles per hour trips. These trains were supposed to run during the summer period, but Network Rail had placed a steam ban due to the heat wave that had crossed Britain at the time. The train, the Tynes T Streak, that was to run from York to Newcastle, was originally scheduled for July 19th, but was moved to August 30th. But by the time August came, the train was postponed again until December 5th that year. But that day was threatened with adverse weather conditions, but it hadn't dampened the performance of Bittern, and it had achieved 93 miles per hour, beating its record that it did in June. However, one passenger claimed that it ran 95 miles per hour according to a GPS device on the train, but it's believed to have been an error. The second train, the Capital Streak, which ran from York to King's Cross, was supposed to run on July 27th, but was later moved to August 31st, but was then moved to December 7th, completing its mission of running 90 miles per hour trains. But the trips weren't about breaking records, but it was to showcase that steam locomotives that are well maintained are capable of running on Britain's national network. After 2013 drew to a close, the visiting North American A4s were placed on display at Barrow Hill Roundhouse deep in what was LMS territory. However, the agreement between the two North American museums and the National Railway Museum stated that the two A4s would not be displayed at other venues. But special dispensation was granted to have them on display at Barrow Hill between February 8th and 9th, 2014, with Bittern alongside. But like everyone who enjoy their holidays to another country, all good things have to come to an end. Between February 15th to the 23rd, 2014, the 6 A4s lined up together one last time at Locomotion at Shildon, before the two North American A4s were to set sail back to their respective countries, with the operational A4s taking passengers in turns on breakband rides on the museum's running line. The two A4s were soon shipped back to North America on April 24th, 2014. Chapter 10. 10 years later. It had been 10 years since the Great Gathering was held, and one wonders, what happened to the A4 locomotives during these past 10 years? Obviously, for the two A4s that reside in North America have been placed back into original positions at their respective museums ever since returning from Britain. Mallard had stayed inside the National Railway Museum ever since returning from the Great Goodbye display at Shildon in 2014. But in 2019 it was let out again to be on display at York Station alongside the Class 800 Azuma as part of the launch of the London North Eastern Railway. After the event, it was placed back in the museum. For Bittern, it was fitted with commemorated plates for its 90 mph runs in 2014, but its mainline certificate was expired in 2015, and just prior to that it was moved to the Midlands Railway where it ran during the year before being withdrawn from service for an overhaul at Crewe. As of 2018, Bittern is now in storage at the site that was once the Holmby factory at Margate in Kent, awaiting to be restored. In September 2015, Union of South Africa had taken the late Queen Elizabeth II and her late husband Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, along with former Scottish First Minister Nicola Sturgeon to reopen the Borders Railway, which runs between Edinburgh Waverley to Tweed Bank. It continued to operate more tours since then, until its owner John Cameron announced in 2017 that it was going to be withdrawn after its boiler ticket was expired and was to be placed in the Farming and Railway Visitor Centre at Fife in Scotland. However, in 2019, Union of South Africa was given an extension of 12 months on its boiler certificate. It hauled its last mainline tour train from Ealing Broadway to York via the Midland Main Line, and was then stored at the National Railway Museum. It then moved to the East Lancashire Railway in October 2020, and was back in steam in April 2021. It was due to remain operational at the Heritage Railway until its boiler ticket was to be expired in April 2022. But that was cut short as on September 4th, 2021, a cracked boiler tube was discovered and was later placed on static display at the Bury Transport Museum in Greater Manchester. Sir Nigel Gresley carried on its duties after the Great Gathering, but in September 2015 its boiler ticket expired and was withdrawn from service for an overhaul which was carried out at the National Railway Museum in York. Its boiler was sent to the Llangollen Railway in Wales the same year for repairs, and was then reunited with the A4's frames in November 2019. A decision made by the NRM in early 2020 to close the workshops for a revamp of the museum for 2025 meant that Sir Nigel Gresley had to vacate the premises, which was to be by July 2021. It was reassembled and was then moved to the Holgate Carriage Works in York, before it was taken by road to Crewe Diesel Traction Maintenance Depot for Locomotive Services Limited to complete the overhaul. It then moved to the Severn Valley Railway in March 2022 in its World War II black livery, where it operated its first service the following month. In January 2023, Sir Nigel Gresley was repainted in BR Blue, and is still running tours today as the only operating A4 locomotive as of the making of this video. A wonderful event that would live on in the minds of everyone who had attended that day in 2013. But one begs to ask the question, how can you top this event when the centenary year of Mallard's record, which is now, as of the release of this video, only 15 years away? Only time will tell.